Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating, the commercial revolution. This is literally the dynamic era that birthed modern banking and the middle class as we know it today. To really get a handle on this massive shift, we're going to use a little thought experiment from our sources. Imagine you're 15 years old, and you're living in Italy in the year 1250.
Okay, so your name is Marco, and your dad, he's a merchant. Every few months, he's traveling all across Europe, buying and selling goods from some pretty distant places. Now, what's really cool about this is that it sets the stage perfectly. Guys like Marco's dad were the absolute lifeblood of a slowly awakening European economy. They were the ones taking the physical risks, connecting these isolated pockets of the world and laying the groundwork for everything we're about to look at. So the story kicks off with a jolt. One morning, Marco wakes up to all this shouting downstairs. But why the huge commotion? Well, in a medieval town, the arrival of a trading ship wasn't just another day at the office. No way. It was a massive, disruptive event. It meant new wealth, new rumors from the outside world, and an influx of resources that could literally change a town's fortunes overnight.
His dad's yelling, "Marco, hurry up! A ship has arrived from the Mediterranean." Now, think about the significance of the Mediterranean here. As our sources emphasize, this body of water was basically the ultimate superhighway of medieval trade. It was this crucial link connecting local European markets all the way to the sprawling networks of the Silk Road. It acted like a giant funnel for the world's most exotic goods.
It paints such a vivid picture of these docks, doesn't it? Marco runs down, and sailors are unloading spices, cloth, and these strange fruits from faraway lands. The air smells like salt water, fish, and pepper. But putting ourselves in Marco's shoes for a second, we really have to recognize the sheer novelty of this. For a medieval European who was used to a very localized diet and rough, homespun clothing, seeing bright silks and smelling pungent spices, that was practically like encountering alien technology. So Marco asks a totally logical question. Who buys all this stuff? And this really brilliantly illustrates the economic reality of the era. You got to remember that in 1250, the vast majority of people were peasant farmers living under the feudal system. Most of them went their entire lives without ever even seeing a gold coin. So figuring out who actually had the disposable income to buy imported black pepper or silk is central to understanding this whole economic revolution.
His dad just smiles and says, "Everyone with money." And that brings us to a really crucial point. Everyone with money represented a brand new demographic in Europe. Wealth wasn't just tied up in large tracts of land owned by isolated lords anymore. It was actually beginning to pool in the cities, creating this entirely new consumer base that was just hungry for luxury goods and driving demand to unprecedented levels.
Trade is growing rapidly across Europe. Merchants are traveling these huge distances, buying and selling merchandise from all over. And you've got these huge fairs being held in crowded towns where traders meet to exchange goods and ideas. To conceptualize this today, imagine a massive international trade expo crossed with a giant farmers market. These fairs were the buzzing, chaotic epicenters of the medieval economy, pulling in people from hundreds of miles away just to do business. Now, Marco thinks this all sounds super exciting until he sees his dad opening a wooden chest completely filled with gold coins. "You're carrying that across Europe?" he asks, understandably nervous. Carrying physical wealth was a complete logistical nightmare back then. Marco looks at a literal box of heavy treasure and immediately realizes the immense physical danger of dragging it across the continent. His dad just laughs. "If we carry all our money in gold, thieves will rob us before we even reach France." Travel during the Middle Ages was incredibly dangerous. We're talking muddy roads, forests full of robbers, and wars that would just randomly block important trade routes. We really have to emphasize the almost total lack of central authority or organized police forces at the time. The sheer peril of moving physical cash forced these merchants to get highly innovative, and very quickly. So merchants start using new banking systems. Instead of hauling heavy gold everywhere, Marco's dad carries letters from banks, which allow him to safely transfer money between cities. They're also exchanging different currencies, since each kingdom uses its own money. This is such a brilliant illustration of early banking. These letters were essentially bills of exchange, kind of like an early form of a credit card or a traveler's check. You deposit gold in Italy, get a piece of paper, and cash it out in France. It was a total game changer for financial security. As trade expands, banking obviously grows more important. Merchants borrow money to invest in new businesses, and lenders charge interest on those loans. But here's the catch. many church leaders believed usury, which was charging too much interest, was sinful. Why? Because you were essentially profiting off of time, and time belonged to God, not man. Still, trade keeps growing because merchants can make huge profits. And Marco's dad, he definitely likes profits. A little too much, honestly.
Okay, let's see how this builds. Soon, Marco travels with his dad to one of Europe's growing towns. At first, the city looks amazing. The streets are completely crowded with merchants, workers, animals, musicians, travelers from all over. The contrast here is stark. Think about the quiet, isolated feudal manors where most people lived, and compare it to these chaotic, new melting pots of culture and nonstop commerce. It was a completely different world.
But then, Marco notices the smell. It is terrible. A pig walks past him carrying something really suspicious in its mouth. Someone throws dirty water right out of a window. Chickens are just running through the muddy streets. Marco covers his nose and asks, how can people live here? It highlights a major downside to this urban boom. The infrastructure simply couldn't keep up with population growth. The town has very poor sanitation, which means disease spreads incredibly easily in these cramped conditions.
But despite the dirt and the disease, towns just keep growing rapidly because they offer unparalleled opportunities. Let's look at this dynamic shift. Cities became absolute beacons of freedom and upward mobility. In towns, regular people can actually earn money. Skilled workers can join influential guilds to protect their trades. Merchants can become fabulously wealthy. There was even a rule that if a serf could escape their lord and live in a town for a year and a day, they were legally free. That is a massive incentive.
For a lot of people, town life is undeniably rough, but it's still far better than village life under the strict thumb of the feudal system. As towns grow larger, merchants become wealthier and far more powerful. Marco notices something strange happening during a meeting between local nobles and town merchants, where the noble demands more taxes. Now, keep in mind, nobles were used to absolute obedience simply because they owned the land. So what happens next represents a massive macro-historical shift.
Marco's dad stands up and says, "With respect, my lord, without merchants, this town would have no money at all." This single statement is revolutionary. It's the exact moment where cash starts talking louder than titles. The old authority of the sword and the soil is suddenly being challenged by the new authority of the coin. This is a brand new kind of power. For centuries, nobles controlled society exclusively because they owned the land. But now, merchants and craftspeople are becoming part of a growing middle class called the bourgeoisie. And this matters deeply because the rise of the bourgeoisie directly triggers the eventual decline of the entire feudal system. Wealth is decentralizing, and so is power.
Money is slowly becoming just as important as land. And this isn't just a minor economic shift, it's a social earthquake. For the very first time in centuries, your birth didn't strictly dictate your ultimate destiny. If you had the business acumen and the grit, you could actually build influence and power that rivaled the old nobility. With all this new merchant wealth came the funding for education and a sudden desire for knowledge that went far beyond just basic survival. That brings us to Paris, where Marco visits a newly formed university. He expects exciting lessons filled with adventure. Instead, he finds cold rooms and tired students listening to very long lectures, including one student who has probably been asleep for an hour. But despite the dry delivery, Marco learns some incredibly important new ideas there.
European scholars are studying books that were painstakingly preserved by Muslim scholars during earlier centuries. These books contain lost knowledge from ancient Greece about science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. It really shows how interconnected the world was becoming, right? Marco hears teachers discussing logic and reason, including the famous scholar Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas teaches that faith and logic can actually work together instead of fighting each other. That was an idea that completely surprised many people at the time.
Marco also notices another huge structural change. Some books are no longer written only in Latin. Writers are beginning to use vernacular languages, the everyday languages spoken by ordinary people. To understand the impact, imagine if the entire internet was only in a language you didn't speak. That's what Latin was to the common medieval person. The shift to vernacular completely democratized information, allowing people to read stories and ideas in their own native tongue for the very first time.
As Marco returns home, he looks around and realizes Europe is changing everywhere around him. And as we step back to synthesize the themes of this explainer, we can see how Marco's personal journey perfectly mirrors the broader journey of Western civilization during this era. The isolated, static world of the Middle Ages is finally waking up.
As we've seen, this wasn't just a series of random, isolated events. It's a total domino effect. Expanding trade built the towns. The booming towns enriched the merchants. The wealthy merchants challenged the nobles, and that very same merchant wealth funded the universities that spread new knowledge. Every single piece of the puzzle is connected.
Europe was slowly becoming more connected, wealthier, and more modern, stepping out of the Middle Ages and into a world driven by commerce, cash, and ideas. The foundation for the modern economy was laid right here, in the mud of these growing towns. But it leaves us with a fascinating question to ponder. As our own economy shifts rapidly into digital spaces and artificial intelligence, what new middle class or entirely new power structures are we creating today?